Mark Latham was once a shining light of the Labour Party, leading them against John Howard in the 2004 election. However, he botched the campaign. Part of the problem was releasing policies far too late, a mistake that Peter Dutton would of course repeat in 2025. However, a larger issue was that Mark Latham came across as something of a thug and had a bit of a self-destruct feature. Allegations were surfaced, for example, that he had punched a political rival in the Liverpool council election, something that Mark Latham did, however, deny. There's also footage of Mark Latham appearing to aggressively stand over John Howard when they were shaking hands. Now, Mark Latham claimed that it was innocuous. However, it did look a little bit aggressive, bullying, or intimidating, and that's certainly how it was reported. Mark Latham appeared to be far too aggressive for the electorate, and appeared to just go off the rails, which is partly why the electorate voted against him. However, lo and behold, coming back to 2025, Mark Latham appears to have gone off the deep end. He's been expelled from the One Nation Party, and also he appears to have imploded in relation to a relationship breakdown that has recently occurred. Allegations have resurfaced that he may have had sex in Parliament House, or at least in his parliamentary offices. Allegations have also resurfaced that he was sexting while in Parliament. Two things that would probably perhaps get us fired if we were to do so in our workplace. Now, Mark Latham, of course, has claimed that this is a private matter, and parliamentarians have control over what happens in their own offices. So therefore, there's nothing to see here. It's okay if you have sex as long as it's in a private office. Something that most employers would probably dispute. For example, the Australian quotes him as saying, "These matters are private. I'm not making any comment on things that are private. Members of Parliament run their own office. These are not matters of public interest. The truth is, members of Parliament have privilege for whatever happens in their own office, in their own domain, and I'm not dealing with your salacious, voyeuristic exercise." So it appears from this that he believes it's perfectly okay for parliamentarians to be having sex in their office. I just hope that they clean the furniture after they've finished. One wonders whether we need to run a UV light over the carpets in the MP's offices. Now, of course, this came to light in a recent relationship breakdown that Mark Latham had, where a DVO application was levelled against him, alleging things such as domestic abuse, defecating on his partner during sex, and driving a car at her. Now, of course, he denies the allegations, and it remains to be seen exactly how this plays out when the DVO application is heard. Mark Latham, of course, has churned through political parties. He was in Labour, then the Liberal Democrats, and then One Nation. And of course, Pauline Hanson has distanced herself from Mark Latham right now. Indeed, Mark Latham was removed from the position of state leader of One Nation. Part of the reason for this was One Nation's drop in its vote share. However, Mark Latham had been attracting controversy, including his ongoing saga with Alex Greenwich. This involved a Twitter back and forth over which Alex Greenwich sued Mark Latham for defamation. Now, those tweets are now deleted, so I'm going to rely on the application for remedies that Alex Greenwich put in. It starts with a tweet from Susan Metcalf, which went along the lines of, "Mark Latham is a disgusting human being, and people who are considering voting for One Nation need to realise they're voting for an extremely hateful and dangerous individual, who risks causing a great deal of damage to our state." Now, that apparently was quoting Alex Greenwich. Then Mark Latham replied to this, saying, "Disgusting? How does that compare with sticking your dick up a bloke's ass and covering it with shit?" Those are Mark Latham's words. Now, the tweets weren't the only problem. He was quoted in the Daily Telegraph as saying, "Sometimes in public life, when you throw out insults, they come up at you harder and truer. So boo-hoo, Alex Greenwich. When he calls someone a disgusting human being for attending a meeting in a church hall, maybe attention will turn to some of his habits." Greenwich goes into schools talking to kids about being gay. "I don't want to be accused of anything similar. Leaving that kind of content on my socials." So Mark Latham doubled down. Alex Greenwich then sued Mark Latham for defamation. The allegation was that Mark Latham defamed him by insinuating that he engaged in disgusting sexual habits, but not only that, insinuations about his activities at schools, and insinuations that Alex Greenwich was not a fit and proper person to serve in Parliament. The court ultimately agreed with Alex Greenwich, awarding him a total of $140,000 of damages. Of course, Pauline Hanson was nonplussed by the controversy. Pauline Hanson stated, "I'm responding to the comments made by Mark Latham on social media. I want you to know that I don't condone, and neither do my members of parliament or party associates. I think they are disgusting. I have also tried to ring Mark a couple of times, to no avail, and I have clearly sent a text message to him telling him my views, and also I've asked him to give the people an apology. I will leave it at that. It is now over to Mark to answer to the people." Now, Andrew Bolt summarised this by noting that Mark Latham has something of a self-destruct feature. And as if to compound his problems, the Australian Turf Club, which effectively is a horse racing organisation, has doubled down on the criticism. He was reportedly a member of the Australian Turf Club, but no longer. The Australian Turf Club runs Sydney's Randwick Racecourse and Rosehill Race Track. Now, apparently his fellow members were not thrilled with him being a member. The Australian Financial Review reports, "Complaints about his behaviour are long-standing. Key to a recent disgruntlement was Latham's boozy April 5th visit at the $600 a head champagne room at Randwick, where his table for two instead hosted what one neighbour described as up to 8 guests. Apart from Latham, most were female. The number included Latham's former partner, Natalie Matthews, and a sex worker and racehorse owner, Carly Electric. It's like he had a harem," one appalled member told us, adding that it was all pretty sickening and hardly in keeping with the decorum expected of such a venue. Or, they argue, with the member code of conduct, which sets firm strictures for this kind of thing. Contacted for comment, Latham responded, "Are you for real?" He later took to social media to say he had no guests with him, only one other member, while dismissing the complaint as fake, and saying he'd already resigned his membership some weeks ago. Of course, the Australian Financial Review says, for what it's worth, these allegations are merely of Latham and friends acting like they were in a nightclub, rather than in the more staid way people generally act in private rooms. True, photos of dishevelled racegoers are a perennial tabloid staple, but those shots are from the car park, not from the members' stands. Complaints, we're told, were made to management, but at the time they were dropped. This rather echoes what Andrew Bolt also said, that Mark Latham might be becoming something of a pariah. And of course, Mark Latham appears to continue the self-destruct, whether it's the Alex Greenwich issue, or whether it's the DVO, which of course he denies any wrongdoing, or whether it's the possible having sex in his parliamentary offices. Things that most people probably would not be okay with. Nevertheless, Mark Latham continues to sit in Parliament, and likely will continue to do so for quite some time. There have been calls for him to resign, but it doesn't look at all like he is going to do so. And I think many members of the community would probably rather he retire from politics. But you can let me know your thoughts about Mark Latham in the comments below.